Hello again and welcome. I'm Mr. Foes. And as you know, some people like talking about politics and some don't. I apparently like talking about politics. So in today's lecture, we will discuss politics and how they pertain to conservation biology. So if we take a historical approach to our understanding of conservation and politics, then we see there has been a transition through time of land being utilized for sustenance by indigenous and native groups, and it's transitioned from that to land being used by groups who colonized those areas and began to exploit natural resources for economic benefit and expansion and growth. So a lot of our early political programs were devised to mostly to benefit the people who were exploiting those lands, and often left the people who previously lived there with a reduced version of the resources and benefits that they previously experienced. Some of the acts and laws that followed included the Antiquities Act, which helped to establish the national park system. Also, we saw an increase in public awareness drastically influence how politics were implemented, especially in conservation. And recently there's been a growth in public awareness and what we would call a wilderness movement or green movement. And these things have effects on how politics affect conservation. So if we take a closer look at some of the specific things that have happened, you see things like Yosemite was developed as a reserve. Later it became Yosemite National Park. John Muir worked in the late 1800s to develop a private conservation group, the Sierra Club, which is still active today. People like Gifford Pinchot, who helped devise one of the other conservation ethics. President Teddy Roosevelt, who helped to develop the very first national wildlife refuge, as well as set aside many areas of land. As I mentioned before, the Antiquities Act. Also, there were a number of landmark acts and policies that were put in place to boost conservation in the country. If we look at the early 1920s, Aldo Leopold helped to develop the first wilderness, and we'll take a closer look at that as well. And the Sierra Club did more work later on in the 50s, and another significant event that took place in the 60s was the publication of a book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, and this was published in increments in the newspaper. And in the 60s, the newspaper was like Facebook, where people would read it on a regular basis and they would talk about it, and it was something that a lot of people came to read. And what she did during this time was expose some of the problems caused mostly by pesticides on the environment, and this had a significant impact on the green movement of the mid to late 60s and early 70s. So if we look at conservation biology as a discipline, we say that it is a legally empowered discipline. This is because many of the laws that exist to determine how conservation biology is enacted were devised before conservation biology was a discipline. So a lot of the ways in which conservation biology functions is around certain laws and regulations that have been determined by the government. If we look at the way that conservation biology currently functions, we see that it does things like give legal incentives and approval for biodiversity preservation. This means that preserving biodiversity, things like setting aside land and donating land, are seen as public services which can be incentivized through tax breaks and the like. Also, it affirms conservation biology goals and influences the public to value conservation. Through education, through public service announcements, these things are deployed. Also, it provides a legal environment that requires and sustains things like scientific research, management, and monitoring. So there are laws in place that provide funds and support the research, monitoring, regulation, and conservation of our natural resources. Here are a list of some of the major U.S. conservation and environmental legislation that has taken place since the 1960s, including the Wilderness Act of 1964, the Land and Water Conservation Act of 1965, the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and well, you can read the list, and we'll touch on a few of these in detail in a second. So the Wilderness Act of 1964, if you're not familiar, there are some areas of land that are called wildernesses. There are many more wildernesses in the western part of the country than there are in the eastern part. So if you live in Kentucky and you've spent most of your time in Kentucky, you may not have encountered a wilderness, although there is a wilderness that is part of the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. But what defines a wilderness is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, and which meets these 4 points. Now, Aldo Leopold was one of the individuals who helped to develop the Wilderness Act. And it's interesting if we look at this, at what defines a wilderness, the way that people are described as man and man himself sort of assumes that women had no part in wildernesses. But this is really just a testament of the antiquated language of the 60s, and this is not something that is common today. One of the things that's unique about a wilderness is it may be used by the public. People may be able to camp in a wilderness, they may be able to harvest wildlife, they may even be able to harvest timber with certain permits or within certain regulations. Next, in 1965, was the Land and Water Conservation Act. This helped to preserve land for recreational opportunities, and it designated federal revenues, meaning a fund of money that was able to establish and purchase land. So the National Park Service was developed from the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, which gave the federal government the ability to purchase land to set it aside as a national park, which is largely used for recreation. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, or what is also better known as NEPA, requires that anyone who is going to develop something that has potential impacts on the environment must develop an environmental impact statement. And this is a formal statement which explains the ways in which their development may affect the environment. And anybody who's going to build a subdivision or is going to build a factory or build some sort of structure in the environment may be required to develop an environmental impact statement according to the National Environmental Policy Act. So if you're going to be an environmental scientist, this is an act that you will know inside and out, because a lot of the work that environmental scientists do is to make sure that industry and business are adhering to the law outlined in NEPA. What was unique about NEPA is that it was a proactive rather than reactive policy. So previous conservation policies looked at problems and then looked for ways to fix them. This act developed a way to predict or assume which problems may take place and then take proactive steps to prevent them. And it was also important because it recognizes natural resources as having value. Previous to this, it wasn't intuitive that a natural resource was beneficial to the economy. But we understand now that it is, and when natural resources are intact and ecosystems are intact, economies function better. Also, it introduced an environmental assessment as means to guide administrative decision making, to avoid any of the impacts that that development may have on the environment. Next, we see the Clean Air Act of 1970. This required the Environmental Protection Act to set air quality standards, and it regulated things like industrial pollution, and it requires industry to apply for and pay for pollution permits. And the money that comes from these applications is then used to mitigate some of the damage caused by their pollution. It's also used to employ scientists studying air quality, and it pays for their equipment and their facilities. So here's a fun diagram from lung.org and the EPA and greenliving.com, and it just lists some of the statistics related to some of the benefits that have come from the Clean Air Act. Related to the Clean Air Act, but slightly different, is the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. And what this does is it tracks air quality, and specifically it tracks pollutants in air that may be contributing to problems such as respiratory ailments of citizens, or something that's not as big a problem today, acid rain. So if we go to their website, we see that they keep track of these things. The latest year that they have listed is 2016, and they began keeping track and uploading in 1985. So let's take a look at 1985. And let's just look at pH levels. And what this gives us an idea of is the acidity of deposition, or what we call acid rain. And some of you may not have heard of acid rain, or you may not realize that it could be a problem. And so if we look at 1985, the eastern part of the country had a very low pH, or what we consider to be a high acidity. And acid rain was a problem in this region. Well, if we go back and we look at a more recent map, like 2016, and we look at the same data, we see that the pH is much higher, which is closer to neutral and less acidic. And what this tells us is what we've seen, that acid rain has decreased dramatically over this time period. And a lot of this we can credit to the National Atmospheric and Deposition Program. Similar to this, but related to water, is the Clean Water Act of 1972. What this does is this regulates and prevents pollutants from entering water. And it defines its jurisdiction as navigable waters. And you may be wondering, well, what is navigable waters? Well, typically this would be something that you can travel down on a watercraft. But the definition of this is very fuzzy, because some bodies of water can be navigable by a ship one day and only by foot the next, because water levels change over time, or seasonally even. Or maybe you can get a canoe down it, but you can't get a boat with a motor down it. Is that still a navigable stream? Well, the interpretation of this law is placed on the states. So you may see a slightly different interpretation of the definition of navigable waters from state to state. But it regulates things like non-point and point source pollution, which which can affect drinking water, which can affect ecosystems and other natural resources like fisheries. Another act in 1972 is the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act. And what this did is it devised a standard way of telling people where they could pollute. So before this act, there were designated beaches where people could go dump their trash, where businesses would go dump their pollution. And after this act, it was regulation determined that you must take your trash at least 3 miles beyond the beach before you could dump it. And that was only certain types of waste. So I know that doesn't sound like a great regulation, but it was a significant improvement on the lack of regulations that existed before. Also, the Endangered Species Act, with which we should be quite familiar. What this did was it was designed to prevent the extinction of species in the United States and worldwide. Probably the best part about this act is that the determination to list or delist species is based on scientific research alone. Now, that was the case until 1978, when the act was amended to be more sensitive to economic impacts, meaning if the act was going to disrupt the economy, then we could make exceptions to it, which I believe was a major failure to the act. Here's a diagram of one endangered species of fish that lives in Kentucky, the black-side dace. Now, if you live near Lake Cumberland and within the Cumberland River drainage, you may see black-side dace because that's where they live. Another act in 1974 was the National Forest Management Act, and this governs the management and administration of national forests. The largest national forest in Kentucky is in the eastern part of the state, and it's the Daniel Boone National Forest. And along with designating land, this act stressed that forest planning should protect biodiversity and place restrictions on forest use. So it recognized that forests as a natural resource are very important. If you ever travel to, again, the western half of the country, we see much more of the land here is designated and regulated under national forests than in the eastern part, and especially within the Mississippi River drainage, because that's where most of our farms are. By 1980, we had developed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Conservation, and Liability Act, or what is better known as CERCLA, or even better known as the Superfund. What this act does is it takes, again, a preventative approach to what could be problems. And it was devised after a lot of problems had already developed. And what the Superfund is it's a federal fund that places a tax or a burden on any industry who may be working with potential pollutants. And it collects a penalty from them, whether they've polluted or not, and it puts that money into what's called the Superfund, which can then be used to clean up other natural or other disasters caused by other industry. And there are a lot of these in Kentucky, many of which are closed down coal mines, where coal mining is a serious polluter of ecosystems. And instead of pay to clean up the problems that they've caused, a lot of companies will file for bankruptcy and change their name and then open up a new mine somewhere else. And then the burden of cleaning this up gets placed on nobody, or the Superfund is where this steps in. So the Superfund has been used to clean up a lot of environmental hazardous sites in the past, and a lot of people in industry really don't like this because they believe the responsibility should be placed on them to prevent disasters instead of being fined for a disaster they haven't yet caused. So that was a list of several of the national acts and policies. There are also international policies that we can learn from. And when we look at international conservation policies, they typically follow a four-step process. Typically, they define the issue, then they search for facts, and then they create an international body or legislative regime that can address the problem. This would be people from multiple countries who are able to communicate and work together. Then they consolidate and strengthen the legislative regime so that the employment of the act or policy may be more successful. So some major international treaties that have been put in place include the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling in 1937. Many countries do not harvest whales anymore, and since this act. The International Convention for the Protection of Birds in 1950, the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance in 1971, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species in 1973, or better known as CITES, and the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. Or you may also know the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species as CITES. Either way, that's it for this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed.